Welcome to Steel, Oil, and Justice, a tale of two titans, where history unfolds through the voices of those who shaped the nation. In this episode, episode number 1, we step into the turbulent era of industrial expansion and political upheaval, hearing directly from the key figures who built industries, fought for justice, and clashed over the future of America. As you are listening, you are required to take notes, focusing on the following key figures who played a crucial role in shaping this historical moment, key events, what turning points define this era, and key legislation, what laws and policies influence the course of history. At the end of the episode, I'll pose a few reflective questions to deepen your understanding. Be sure to jot down your thoughts and prepare to engage in discussion. If you'd like to follow along, the full script for this podcast is linked in your assignment. If you have any questions, please make sure that you are asking three before me. Now let's step into the past and hear the voices of those who built and battled for America's future. Hello and welcome. Steel, Oil, and Justice, a tale of two titans in the Gilded Age. Abraham Lincoln, April 11th, 1865. The White House. Lincoln's last speech. Abraham Lincoln stood at the window of the White House, gazing at the crowd below. The war was nearly over. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox, but the work of reuniting the country was just beginning. The people in the street cheered his presence, but Lincoln felt uneasy. We must rebuild this nation with malice toward none, with charity for all, he told them, his voice steady but solemn. He outlined his vision for Reconstruction, a gentle plan for the South's return, one that did not seek revenge but unity. He spoke of granting limited rights to freedmen, an idea that made some squirm in their seats. Everyone will be served well by this settlement of this matter. The Union is preserved, he said. Frederick Douglass, April 14th, 1865, Washington, D.C., a final meeting with Lincoln. Frederick Douglass had been in the White House before, more than once. Lincoln had invited him in, an unprecedented act for a sitting president. Mr. Douglass, Lincoln greeted him warmly, shaking his hand. It is good to see you. Douglass took his seat across from the president, observing the deep lines in Lincoln's face. The war has aged him, he thought. Mr. President, I must speak plainly, Douglass said. The war may be ending, yet the real battle for justice is only beginning. We cannot allow the South to return to power as if nothing has changed. Lincoln nodded slowly. I know, but we must reunite the nation carefully. Douglass clenched his jaw. And what of the freedmen? They must have land, education, and most of all, the vote. Otherwise, they will never be truly free. Lincoln sighed. You ask for too much, Mr. Douglass. And I do not disagree, but we must move carefully. If I push too hard, I will lose the Union I fought to preserve. Freedom without power is a hollow promise, Mr. President, Douglass warned. Lincoln leaned back, considering. He knew Douglass was right. Adjusting his coat against the crisp autumn air of 1865, Frederick Douglass stood outside the capital of Washington, D.C. The 13th Amendment had been ratified, officially abolishing slavery, and 4 million formerly enslaved Black Americans had found themselves legally free. He had spent decades speaking, writing, and advocating for Black equality. And now that the war was over, the South was already trying to strip newly freed Black Americans of their rights. Black codes were springing up, restricting movement, voting, and employment. The end of the Civil War was supposed to mark the beginning of freedom and equality for all. But as Frederick Douglass stood on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, watching the Union's victory be celebrated, he knew one bitter truth. Slavery is not abolished until the Black man has the ballot. Freedom meant little if Black Americans had no rights, no land, no protection, and no economic independence. Abraham Lincoln, April 15th, 1865, Washington, D.C., a final meeting with Thaddeus Stevens. He turned away from the window, concerned by the look on Thaddeus Stevens, the fiery radical Republican. Lincoln already knew what Stevens was thinking. You go too easy on these rebels, Mr. President, Stevens grumbled. How can you speak of mercy when they built a nation on human bondage? If we push too harshly, we push them deeper into resentment, Lincoln countered. We need peace, not another war. Before Stevens could press further, Lincoln's secretary approached. Mr. President, Ford's Theater is expecting you tonight. Lincoln sighed, already feeling the weight of his exhaustion. One evening of distraction couldn't hurt, he thought. By midnight, Abraham Lincoln was dead, and the future of Reconstruction was left in far less forgiving hands. Andrew Johnson, May 29th, 1865. The White House, a cabinet meeting. President Andrew Johnson sat at the head of the table, his face emotionless. The nation's power brokers, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, Secretary of State William Seward, and others watched him closely. The question before them was simple. How should the South be brought back into the Union? Lincoln's plan was lenient, Seward began cautiously. Do you intend to follow his lead? Johnson grunted, leaning back in his chair. Leniency. The South deserves punishment, but not from the government. The people must handle it. Stanton narrowed his eyes. And what does that mean, sir? It means we restore the Union without giving these damn radicals the power to upend society, Johnson snapped. Let the Southern states control their own affairs. If they wish to keep the Negro in his place, that's their right. Gasp filled the room. But Johnson continued. I will issue pardons to nearly all Confederates, and I will allow Southern states to decide their own course. The Union is restored, gentlemen. Reconstruction is over. No one spoke, but the implication was clear. The South would return to power almost unchallenged, and Black Americans would soon find themselves free in name but shackled by law. Note, with the South in ruins, President Andrew Johnson pushed for quicker integration of the Confederate States. But at what cost? Southern leaders quickly enacted black codes restricting the freedom of newly freed Black Americans. Resistance in the South was violent. Groups like the Ku Klux Klans terrorized Black voters. Federal troops were sent to enforce the law, leading to a tense battle between the federal government and Southern elites. Frederick Douglass, September 1865, Washington, D.C., a public challenge to Johnson. When Douglass heard Johnson's plan, rage burned in his chest. They would have the Negro freed, but not the Negro man, he said. The black codes had revived slavery under a different name. Black men could be arrested for vagrancy and forced into labor contracts with white landowners. Douglass requested an audience with President Johnson, but this time the White House doors remained closed. So he took his message to the public. Standing before a crowd in Boston, Douglass thundered, "We were promised freedom, but without land, without education, without the vote, the Negro is left at the mercy of those who once held him in bondage. President Johnson tells us to wait, but we say the hour of justice is now." Radical Republicans in Congress heard his words. Days later, Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner called an emergency meeting. Thaddeus Stevens, December 1865. Private meeting with Charles Sumner, a radical Republican strategy session. Thaddeus Stevens paced his office in the Capitol. Across from him, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts sat, his fingers stippled. "Johnson is undoing everything," Stevens growled. "He's pardoning Confederate leaders. The black codes are spreading like wildfire. Slavery is reborn under a different name." Sumner nodded grimly. "We must act now, or the South will win the peace." "We need a plan." Stevens stopped pacing. "Radical Reconstruction must be enforced. We will not let the South treat freedmen as slaves." Sumner leaned forward. "Then we start with two things: the Freedmen's Bureau and a Civil Rights Act. Black men must be protected, land, schools, and the vote." Stevens smirked. "And when Johnson vetoes it," Sumner met his gaze, "we override it. We will not be Lincoln's gentle hand. We will be the hammer." The next day, Stevens and Sumner introduced legislation from the Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, laying the groundwork for radical Reconstruction. The Freedmen's Bureau, a lifeline for Black Americans. Recognizing the challenges ahead, Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau in March of 1865 to assist freedmen in the aftermath of the war. The Freedmen's Bureau will provide food, clothing, and medical aid, helped establish schools and Black colleges, such as Howard University, assisted Black Americans in negotiating fair labor contracts, helped freedmen reunite with lost family members. The Bureau faced immense resistance from white Southerners. President Andrew Johnson, a staunch supporter of states' rights, vetoed its renewal the following year, effectively weakening its power. Without federal protection, Black Americans faced brutal oppressions in the South. The Black Codes, a return to slavery by a different name. After the war, Southern states quickly passed Black Codes, a series of racist laws designed to keep Black Americans in a permanent state of economic dependence. The Black Codes made it illegal for Black people to be unemployed, forcing them into labor contracts. Restricted where freedmen could live and work. Banned Black Americans from owning land in many Southern states. Allowed the arrest of vagrants, unemployed black men who were then forced into unpaid labor, a system eerily similar to chattel slavery. Black Americans had been freed from chattel slavery, but now they were being pushed into a new form of bondage called sharecropping. Sharecropping, economic slavery, 1865 to the 1900s. Without land or resource, many freed Black Americans had no choice but to work for their former enslavers under a system known as sharecropping. How did it work? A landowner, often a former slave owner, would loan Black families land, tools, and seeds. The Black family would farm the land and give a share, usually 50% of their crops, to the landowner as rent. Since most sharecroppers were forced to buy supplies on credit, they fell into debt they could never repay. Under harsh contract laws, leaving the land before debts were paid was illegal, trapping sharecroppers in a cycle of generational poverty. By 1870, 75% of Black Americans in the South were sharecroppers, effectively enslaved by debt and the legal system. Douglass and other Black leaders pushed for land reform, arguing that freedom without economic independence was meaningless. However, efforts like Sherman's Special Field Order Number 15, which promised freedmen 40 acres and a mule, were revoked by President Andrew Johnson, returning most confiscated land to white Southern elites. With the failure of land reform and the rise of white supremacy violence, Black freedom was under siege. Ulysses S. Grant, 1866. Washington, D.C., a private meeting with President Johnson. General Ulysses S. Grant, the war hero of the Union, sat stiffly in the Oval Office. He had come at Andrew Johnson's request, but this was a conversation he was expecting. Johnson leaned forward. General Grant, you're popular. You're so popular. You could help put an end to this radical Republican nonsense. Support my Reconstruction policies, and I'll make sure your future in Washington is secure. Grant's jaw tightened. He had fought too hard to see the country torn apart again. Mr. President, with all due respect, your policies are failing. The black codes, the violence in the South, this isn't unity, it's surrender. Johnson's face darkened. Those radicals, Stevens, Sumner, want to rule the South like tyrants. They want to ensure that the sacrifices of the war were not in vain, Grant shouted back. The men I commanded did not die so that the old South could rise again. The conversation ended in icy silence. Johnson had expected loyalty. Instead, he found opposition. Grant left the meeting with one conclusion. If Reconstruction were to succeed, he would have to lead it himself. Andrew Johnson versus Congress, March 1867. The White House. A veto becomes a fight. Johnson slammed his fist on the desk. The damn radicals are taking over the government. His aide stood frozen as he glared at the document before him. The Reconstruction Act of 1867, passed by Stevens and Sumner's radical Republicans. This act divided the South into military districts, required new state governments with black suffrage, forced ratification of the 14th Amendment. This is tyranny, Johnson bellowed. The South has already rejoined the Union. He grabbed a pen and scrawled his veto. but Congress overrode him within days. Reconstruction would now be led by radical Republicans, not by Johnson. Months later, he would be impeached, barely escaping removal by one vote. The Reconstruction Act of 1867. Grant takes command. Washington, D.C. Military rules begins. Congress, led by Stevens and Sumner, had overpowered Johnson. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 was law. Now, Ulysses S. Grant had a new mission: enforce Reconstruction in the South. The South was divided into five military districts. Union troops occupied the region to protect black citizens. New state governments had to include black men. Radical Republicans had won. Johnson had lost, but the fight was far from over. Frederick Douglass and Ulysses S. Grant, 1868. Washington, D.C., a private meeting before Grant's election. Frederick Douglass had been watching Ulysses S. Grant closely. Though a Union war hero, Grant had not yet proven his commitment to Black Americans. Douglass was determined to find out where he stood. General Grant, Douglass greeted him. Grant, ever a man of few words, simply nodded. The radicals believe you are the only man who can preserve Reconstruction, Douglass began. But will you fight for us? Grant sighed. The South is resisting every effort to enforce these laws. I do not seek conflict, Mr. Douglass, but I will not let the Union be torn apart again. Then you must do more than just hold the Union together, Douglass pressed. You must protect the freedmen from the rising terror of the Ku Klux Klan. If you do nothing, their freedom will be stolen from them. Grant met Douglass' eyes. If I win the presidency, I will use every power at my disposal to defend their rights. Douglass extended his hand. Then you have my support. That year, Ulysses S. Grant was elected president with the backing of black voters and the radical Republicans. Rockefeller and the rise of the industry. Meanwhile, up north, another man was preparing for his own future. John D. Rockefeller, a young businessman in Cleveland, saw a different war brewing, a war for economic dominance. Oil, discovered in Titusville, Pennsylvania, was becoming the fuel of the future, and Rockefeller had determined to control it. This is the future, Rockefeller muttered, staring at the bubbling black liquid, and I intend to own it. While Douglass fought against racist policies in D.C. and down south, Rockefeller fought his rivals. He founded Standard Oil in 1870, crushing smaller refineries by offering lower prices and secret deals with railroads. Soon, he controlled 90% of the nation's oil. His wealth skyrocketed, and so did accusations of monopoly and corruption.